Hey everyone. So here's everything you need to know for the unfamiliar listening section for your fourth quiz. In this video, I'm going to go through all the different genres and what to listen for, and then in the next video, we'll do some guided practice together. So before we go over the new genres from the Romantic era, I just want to recap the old genres, which you've seen before. So for voices only, you have chant and madrigal. Voices and instruments, you have opera and oratorio, the difference being one is sacred, one is secular, but you're listening for the same stuff, aria, recitative, chorus. It could also play a classical opera, and really the only difference between the classical and the Baroque opera is in Baroque opera, you'll hear harpsichord, and in classical, you won't. For instrument only genres that we've seen before, you have the concerto, so a soloist plus the orchestra. You have the fugue, which is going to be either a harpsichord or an organ fugue. If you hear only strings, you're listening to a string quartet, and orchestra, you're listening to a symphony. Now, both string quartet and symphony follow the four movement cycle, so a fast first and last movement, or a slow second movement, or a triple meter third. In the case of a concerto, you still have the fast first and last movement and the slow middle movement. You're just missing that triple meter third movement in the middle. If you hear harpsichord on any of the unfamiliar pieces I play, the first thing I want you to think is I'm listening to a piece from the Baroque era. Because again, once the piano was invented at the beginning of the classical era, composers really stopped using the harpsichord. So those are the old genres. On to the new genres. If I play you a piece where you hear just voice and piano, you're listening to a lead or a parlor song. So these were two of our smaller genres. Now, how do you tell the difference between a lead and a parlor song? So the lead is going to be number one in German. If you remember, lead is just the German word for song. So German lieder generally are going to have a much more complex piano part. The voice, the melody that the singer sings is usually going to be a little bit more on the challenging side. And you'll often have a lot more dissonance or like complex sounding chords. So think Schubert's Erlking, the really dramatic father and his son racing on the horse with the really complicated piano part. And lieder were supposed to be performed by professionals. That's who it was written for. On the other hand, a parlor song is an American genre, so it's going to be in English. But also, in addition to that, you're going to hear a much simpler piano part, usually just chords. The voice part's usually going to be easier as well. Very sort of simple harmonies, simple melodies. Think Stephen Foster's Jeannie with the light brown hair. As opposed to lieder, parlor songs were meant to be performed by amateurs, by middle class families in their living room. So different performers, different audiences. That's why the pieces sound so different. If you hear only piano, solo piano, you are listening to a character piece. Usually, character pieces from the Romantic era are going to be a little bit more virtuosic. They're called character pieces because they're quasi programmatic. They're supposed to be evocative of some extra musical thing. So Chopin's Mazurka is inspired by a dance. Liszt's La Campanella, the little bell, you're supposed to hear that little bell. So that's a character piece. Now, for the larger genres, if you hear only orchestra, it would be a program symphony. So, how do you tell the difference between a romantic program symphony and a classical symphony? Number one, in a classical symphony, usually you're going to hear much more straightforward melodies. You'll hear themes presented right away. In a romantic program symphony, you'll usually, again, thinking about romantic characteristics, have a lot more dissonance. It'll be a lot more complicated. And if you think back to Berlioz's March to the Scaffold, without knowing what the music was supposed to represent, it wouldn't really make sense, right? So you hear this really big march-like buildup, everybody falls silent, and there's a random clarinet solo before our artist's head gets chopped off and bounces down the stairs. So the music in the program symphony is going to sound a lot more sometimes atmospheric, like it's supposed to be sounding behind a movie or something like that. Because again, there's a story. So the big difference between classical symphony, romantic program symphony, is that the romantic program symphony is programmatic. It's trying to tell a story. Now, the reason it's a little bit difficult to tell between those two just by listening. So if I give you a title on the quiz that says something like Movement to a Ball, you're going to know automatically that the piece is programmatic, because a ball lets you know that you're supposed to be listening to music at a ball or a dance, just like Berlioz's Movement 4, March to the Scaffold from Symphonie Fantastique. So in the classical era, you have Beethoven Symphony No. 5, Movement 1, so straightforward name. Romantic era, Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, title Movement No. 4, March to the Scaffold, also a title for the movement. Now, if you hear voice and orchestra, you're listening to opera. So we have opera from the Baroque, the classical, and the Romantic. You know how to tell the difference between Baroque and classical. For Romantic opera, opera sort of goes a bunch of different ways in the Romantic era, but for our purposes, I would play you something reminiscent of Wagner. So if you remember back to class, we listened to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. Huge orchestra, a lot of dissonance, really dramatic, big voices, right? Huge operatic singing style. And with Wagner, he sort of breaks the mold of aria, recitative, chorus. So instead, you're going to hear sometimes song-like singing, sometimes speech-like. It's going to be a lot more fluid as opposed to an opera from the classical era like Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, Non so più, the recitative, the trio, etc. Okay, before we do practice in the next video, the way that I would go about doing unfamiliar listening practice on Naxos is on your phone. So you all should have downloaded the Naxos app, and here's why I want you to use the app instead of using your desktop. So on your phone, when you open the Naxos app, it'll show you this screen. You'll go down to the bottom and hit Playlist, which will take you here. Click on Cal Poly. It'll take you to this screen. Click on Music 120, Music Appreciation, and that'll take you here. So here are all the playlists for our class. You're going to go to Quiz for Unfamiliar Listening, and that'll give you this screen. So once you're here, you're not quite done yet. So let's just click on the first one. So you click on the first piece, it'll start playing. And once it starts playing, you'll see this little bar pop up at the bottom. So instead of just listening here, I want you to click on that bar and it'll open up this player screen. And here's why I want you to do that. When you're listening to the piece, Naxos gives you a bunch of information about the music that you don't necessarily need for the purposes of practicing for our quiz. So I have gone in and typed up just the information you need, which is right here. So you can listen to the piece, look on your phone, and you'll see chant Middle Ages, which is all you need to know. The other thing you can do once you open this window is at the very bottom left, you can hit the shuffle button, and that way you can quiz yourself without having to look at the playlist. Okay, so I hope that clears up the differences between the genres that you're listening for. Check out the next video and we'll do some guided listening practice together.